I should have known better. That's the thought that keeps looping in my head when the noise fades and I'm finally alone with my past. Because when you look at success from the outside, it looks clean, logical, almost inevitable. But from the inside, it's chaotic, emotional, and full of moments where you feel like you're barely holding things together. And people assume regret comes from failure, but that's not true. Regret comes from knowing you saw the warning signs and still kept going, from realizing that intelligence doesn't protect you from repeating your own patterns. And when I look back at my early years, I see someone who believed that working harder could solve everything, that intensity was a substitute for wisdom, and that obsession was the same as purpose. But it's not, because, obsession can blind you. It narrows your vision till all you see is the goal and none of the damage along the way. And I ignored people who cared about me, not because I didn't value them, but because I thought time was infinite, and problems could be fixed later. And later is a dangerous word. Later is where most regrets live, because later assumes you'll have the chance to slow down and reflect. But life doesn't wait for you to be ready. It just keeps moving. And I told myself that sacrifice was noble, that pressure was necessary, that if I just pushed through, everything would eventually make sense. But what I didn't understand was that every decision compounds, not just financially or professionally, but emotionally, mentally, personally, and the cost doesn't show up immediately. It shows up quietly, in strained relationships, in exhaustion that sleep doesn't fix, in moments where you achieve something extraordinary and feel absolutely nothing. And that's when the thought hits you the hardest. I should have known better, because deep down, I did know, I just chose to ignore it. And that choice shaped more of my life than any success ever did. I kept telling myself this time would be different. And that lie was more convincing every time I repeated it, because when you're driven by vision and pressure, patterns disguise themselves as progress. And I didn't recognize that I wasn't just building companies. I was repeating the same emotional loop over and over again, a loop where urgency replaced balance and intensity replaced clarity. And I convinced myself that constant stress was the price of doing something meaningful, that if things felt overwhelming, it meant I was on the right path. But what I failed to see was that I wasn't just demanding excellence from the work. I was demanding it from people, from relationships, from myself, without understanding the cost. And the cost always arrives later, quietly, when the adrenaline fad. The S and the wins stop feeling like wins because patterns don't announce themselves as mistakes. They feel familiar, they feel productive, they feel necessary. And I thought being aware made me immune. I thought because I could analyze systems and predict outcomes that I could also outthink my own behavior, but self-awareness without restraint is useless because knowing your flaw doesn't stop it. ROM controlling you if you keep rewarding it, and I rewarded my worst habits with success, with validation, with the world telling me I was right, and that's dangerous because success can be the most convincing excuse to avoid change. And every time something worked despite the chaos, it reinforced the belief that the chaos was essential, that the pressure was part of the formula, and I ignored T. Moments when people pulled away, when conversations became shorter, when trust quietly eroded, because those signs didn't feel urgent compared to deadlines and launches and survival. And I told myself relationships could be repaired later, but later rarely comes when you live in constant acceleration. And the truth is, I wasn't just afraid of slowing down, I was afraid of what I'd feel if I did. Because stillness forces reflection, and reflection forces accountability, and accountability means admitting that some of the pain around you didn't have to exist, that some losses weren't inevitable, they were choices, and that realization is harder than any technical problem I've ever solved, because you can't debug your past without confronting your ego. And my ego told me that pushing harder, always the answer, that empathy could wait, that emotional cost was secondary to survival, but survival mode isn't meant to be permanent. And living there too long rewires how you think, how you react, how you treat people. And I became someone who normalized extremes, who believed exhaustion was normal and burnout was weakness, who mistook resilience for denial. And the worst part is that it didn't feel wrong while it was happening. It felt necessary. It felt justified. It felt like leadership. And only later, when I look back at the trail of moments I rushed through, the conversations I postponed, the warnings I dismissed, did the pattern become obvious. And that's when the regret deepens, not because you didn't know better, but because you did know better and chose momentum over in fullness. And I realized that repeating mistake doesn't mean you didn't learn the lesson. It means you learned it, but didn't respect it enough to change. And that's the most uncomfortable admission of all, because it means the problem was never intelligence, resources, or opportunity. It was discipline over my own impulses, and until you break the pattern, no amount of achievement will save you. Or from meeting the same regret again, in a different form. Nobody tells you this part when they celebrate your success, but every choice extracts a cost, whether you acknowledge it or not. And the bill doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives in fragments, in moments you barely notice until they stack up and suddenly you're carrying more weight than you remember agreeing to. And I didn't feel the cost. While I was moving at full speed because motion numbs awareness, but when things slowed down even briefly, the weight became impossible to ignore. Because the cost wasn't just time or money or stress, it was presence, it was trust. It was pieces of myself I kept postponing until some imagined future where things would finally calm down. And I told myself that sacrifice was temporary, that intense it. Why was a phase, but years passed and the phase became my identity, and that's when the cost turned personal. Because you start measuring life only in outputs and milestones, not in moments or connections, and you don't notice how much you're missing because missing things becomes normal. Birthdays turn into obligations, conversations turn into transactions, silence turns into something you avoid because it forces you to hear thoughts you've been outrunning. And I learned that you can build extraordinary things while quietly dismantling parts of your own life, and the world will applaud you for it because the world rewards results, not balance, and it doesn't care what you traded to get there. And I traded more than I realized. I traded patience for urgency, empathy for efficiency, reflecti, on for momentum. And the dangerous thing about that trade is that it works in the short term, it produces outcomes, it creates headlines, it validates your approach, but internally it creates a kind of emotional debt. And emotional debt compounds just like financial debt, except there's no interest rate you can calculate, no clear payoff date. It just grows quietly until it shows up as exhaustion. You can't explain, irritability you can't control, distance you can't bridge with logic. And I felt that distance in rooms full of people, in moments where I should have felt proud, but instead felt disconnected. Like I was watching my own life from the outside. And that's when it hit me that achievement doesn't guarantee fulfillment. Ambition doesn't automatically equal meaning, because meaning requires presence. And presence is the first thing you sacrifice when you're always racing the clock. And I told myself that pressure was unavoidable, that the mission demanded it, but at some point you have to ask whether the mission justifies the collateral damage. And that's a question I avoided for a long time because answering it honestly would have forced me to change, and change felt like slow. Wing down and slowing down felt like failure because I had conditioned myself to believe that relentless forward motion was the only way to survive, and that belief isolated me more than any external criticism ever could because it made vulnerability feel dangerous, it made rest feel irresponsible, it made reflection feel like weakness, and the cost of that mindset isn't just burnout, it's eros, erosion of joy, erosion of trust, erosion of the ability to be fully present even when you want to be. And I reached moments where the noise finally stopped, and instead of peace, I felt emptiness, not because there was nothing there, but because I had neglected the internal world for so long that I didn't know how to inhabit it anymore. And that's a terrifying realization because you can't engineer your way out of it, you can't delegate it, you can't outwork it, you have to face it, and facing it means acknowledging that some of the losses weren't the price of ambition, they were the result of avoidance. And that distinction matters because ambition can coexist with balance, but avoidance always creates regret. And the hardest part wasn't admitting the cost existed, it was admitting that I had the power to reduce it and chose not to because power brings responsibility, and responsibility brings accountability, and accountability forces you to see yourself clearly without the shield of results or reputation. And when I finally did that, I realized that the biggest cost wasn't what I lost externally, it was how long it took me to recognize that success without self-awareness. It's just another form of failure waiting to happen. If I could go back and say, one thing to my younger self, it wouldn't be about strategy or timing or even ambition. It would be this: don't confuse intensity with truth, because intensity feels productive, but it can quietly disconnect you from what actually matters. And the lesson I learned too late is that progress without alignment eventually sin of resistance. And resistance always shows up as regret, because life has a way of forcing you to confront the parts of yourself you postpone, and no amount of success can shield you from that moment. And I used to believe that the future would justify everything, that once the mission was secure, the sacrifices would retroactively make sense, but the future doesn't erase the past. It only knifies it, and when you finally slow down enough to look back, you don't measure your life by how hard you pushed. You measure it by what you preserved while pushing, and that's where the warning begins, because the same mindset that helps you build something extraordinary can also dismantle your inner world if you don't set boundaries around it, and boundaries aren't limitations, they're safeguards. RDS, they protect clarity, relationships, and perspective, and I ignored that because I thought boundaries were for people who lacked urgency, but urgency without wisdom is just acceleration toward burnout. And I wish I had understood sooner that you don't lose momentum by being intentional. You lose momentum by running blindly until something breaks, and something always breaks, whether it's your health, your relationships, your sense of meaning, or your ability to feel present in your own life. And I learned that reflection isn't a luxury reserved for later. It's a requirement for sustainability, because without reflection, you repeat yourself, and repetition without awareness turns into regret. And that's the pattern I'm warning you about, the one where you tell yourself you'll fix things later, that you'll slow down after this milestone, that you'll be more present once the pressure eases, because the pressure rarely eases on its own. You have to choose to change how you respond to it, and that choice feels uncomfortable at first because it goes against the identity you've built, the identity of being the one who never stops, never rests, never doubts. But strength isn't the absence of doubt, it's the willingness to question your own habits before they harden into consequences. And I learned that self-mastery matters more than raw drive, because drive without self-mastery turns you into someone who achieves a lot and understands very little about themselves. And understanding yourself is the foundation of everything else. Because if you don't understand your limits, your motivations, your fears, you'll keep chasing goals that don't actually satisfy you. And satisfaction isn't the enemy of ambition. It's what gives ambition direction. And I would tell you this too: listen when the discomfort shows up quietly, when something feels off. Even if everything looks successful on paper, because that discomfort is information, not weakness. And ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. It just makes it louder later. And I ignored it for too long because I thought acknowledging it meant slowing down, but what it really meant was recalibrating. And recalibration is how you prevent regret from becoming permanent. And the final lesson is this: you don't get a separate life later where you finally live fully. This is the life happening now, in between the goals, in between the pressure, in between the chaos. And if you're not present here, no future achievement will fix that absence. And when I look back and say I should have known better, what I really mean is that I knew the answers, I just didn't prioritize them. And priorities reveal values, and values shape outcomes far beyond success. So take this as a warning not to abandon ambition, but to anchor it, to make. Be sure that as you build, you're not erasing yourself in the process, because the real regret isn't failing, it's succeeding at the cost of becoming someone you no longer recognize.